it would be legitimate to ask, why here are we discussing a 100-year-old document? How many other societies go into the details of a letter written 100 years ago? And the reason that we're doing it, the reason that you're here is that, and here I'd like to quote Roger Fisher, who was a professor of law at Harvard, and he said, "Legitimacy and lawful authority are key components of political power." And he was correct. Legitimacy is awfully, awfully important for everybody. It's important for Israel. And by the way, here, a quote from a Palestinian author who is no friend of Israel. He wrote a violently anti-Israeli book. And by the way, from its title, you can guess its context. The title, the Palestinian lawyer was Victor Katan. He was a good lawyer. And he wrote, "From coexistence to conquest," which already gives you the sense of it. And what does he write about this? I'm quoting verbatim. "International law was pivotal to the development of the Jewish national home." And he was right. And he continues 10 pages later. "Ultimately, international law would give the Zionist movement legitimacy." He was bang on. It was off. Obviously, without the Israeli Defense Forces, we wouldn't exist. But given your existence, political legitimacy is a very, very powerful weapon, very, very powerful asset. It's true for tiny Israel. It's even true for superpowers. If you recall the European, including Dutch, reaction to the US violations of international law, which they did, torturing Guantanamo, clearly a violation of international law, they lost the support of their key allies. Germany, Italy, Netherlands, UK refused to cooperate with it. This is the great superpower. It's certainly true for a tiny little Israel. We need legitimacy. It's awfully, awfully important. Why is it important? It's important for a number of issues. A, you need the support of democracies. And democracies are dependent on public opinion. Parliaments, national assemblies are dependent on public opinion. They will not support something which is branded as illegal. Second, by the way, is even in negotiations. When you negotiate, you must negotiate, and I had the privilege of negotiating with the Egyptians, Jordanians, and to a lesser extent with the Palestinians. You must come on the basis of you have rights, which you may be willing to concede. You may be willing to make a compromise. You cannot make a compromise on something that is not yours. So it's awfully important in the negotiations to say, we have rights. Maybe we're willing to reach a compromise. Personally, I hope we will. But you can only compromise on something that you have. It's important for the negotiations. It's very, very important for the world. The world is a kibitzer on our negotiation with the Palestinians. Why? I don't know. But there's a fascination with this tiny piece of land and our negotiations. The world is fascinated, and the moment something is branded as not legal, we've lost it. And by the way, as an Israeli lawyer, I must admit, we haven't succeeded in persuading international lawyers, to a large extent, on the question of settlements. We have a good case, I'll come to it, but we haven't succeeded. For the other side, for the Palestinians, when we come to negotiate with them, this is a tremendous bonus. They can sit at the table and say, nothing to negotiate. The Europeans consider it to be illegal. Give it up. Tremendous asset. Awfully important for us. By the way, I should add, perhaps to a lesser extent, it's important because both Israeli and Palestinian societies are based on legal codes. Legal arguments are part of the life of Israelis and of Palestinians. And in Israel, as in other democracies, of course, the courts enforce international law. This is not true of totalitarian states. No court in a totalitarian state is going to give a judgment against the government on the basis of international law. But in Israel, it has been done. Time and again, when the Israeli courts have come to the conclusion the government is not complying with international law, it's given orders to enforce it, not only in Israel, this is true of other European countries, even the United States, but certainly UK and France and other countries. Therefore, international law is a vital element, and the Palestinians are aware of this. And what we're seeing, and you're seeing it here very much, is an attempt to delegitimize Israel, and they're putting tremendous financial and other efforts in to try and delegitimize Israel, knowing that it would harm. And this is something we have to try and contest. Part of this starts with a document we were just hearing about, the Balfour Declaration. And you may have seen in the papers, there were demonstrations in London about the illegality of the Balfour Declaration. And the Palestinians know exactly what they're doing. They want to try and undermine what they see as one of the basic documents providing Israel with legitimacy. How do they do it? Based to a large extent on two arguments. The first is, Palestine didn't belong to the British. It was Ottoman. What are you giving somebody else's territory to the Jews? The second argument, they say, is it violates the right of self-determination. These are the two twin arguments. You must have heard them here as well, of claiming the illegitimacy of the Balfour Declaration. And they're both, I think, false. First of all, Britain clearly made it very clear that it would implement the Balfour Declaration should it acquire Palestine. And by the way, I assume that internal lawyers here who know this is perfectly legitimate in any legal system. You can say, I will lease you or rent you a house if I purchase it. Perfectly legal. If you don't purchase it, you have no obligation. If you do, you're obliged to it. This is exactly what the British said. And by the way, it was quite clear in November 1917 that they were going to defeat the Turks. Absolutely clear. But they hadn't. They'd captured half of Palestine. They had reached they reached Jerusalem a couple of weeks later. So what their promise was, thank you. Where can I put it so it won't spill? Thanks. Thank you. So what we had here was a clear legal argument saying, should we acquire Palestine? In brackets, it was quite clear that they were going to acquire it. This is what we'll do. The second argument was self-determination. And here there's two issues. The first is, at the time, it was not a rule of international law. And the proof is colonies. Colonies, and even the Netherlands has its history of colonies, were perfectly legal until the Second World War. Think of the situation in Africa. No international lawyer at the time said it was not illegal. It was a political principle. It was not legally a legal principle. But even, I think, more fundamental. And this we've discovered from the British archives that have now opened up the correspondence between Lloyd George, Curzon, and Balfour, and the people involved in it. They were aware of this issue, and they made a very salient point. They say, we are aware that the majority of the population of Palestine in 1917 were not Jews. However, we want to allow them to return to their country. They were exiled from their country. They were the indigenous people. They didn't use the word indigenous, but they were exiled. When they return, they will then become a majority. And they made the point, it's a specific form of self-determination, different from the others. They added, we're giving immediate self-determination to the whole of the rest of the Ottoman Empire. And it's worth remembering that prior to the First World War, there was no independent Arab nation. They all became independent as a result of the First World War, of Britain defeating the Ottoman Empire. And they made, and it's quite clear, in their correspondence, they made the deliberate decision, we're going to give Arabs independence in the whole enormous, including Iraq and Egypt, this tiny little sliver of land, we're going to allow the Jews to return. That will be their self-determination. The British and the French, by the way, were very, very aware of international law at the time. And if you look at the legal construction they made, they followed international law to the dot. Under international law at the time, 1917, they could have said, we acquired this territory by war, it's ours. And again, I'm speaking to a European audience, you know that borders of Europe, in the 19th century, were all decided by military conquest. Nevertheless, they say, we're not going to do that. And they reach an agreement with the Ottomans, with the Turks, who were no longer the Ottomans, with the Turks, in which the Turkish government officially gave up all its empire to Britain and to France. Treaty of Sèvres, which was afterwards ratified in Lausanne. And why did they do this? Because Turkey decided it was not going to be an empire anymore. They restricted themselves to the territory of modern-day Turkey. The rest of the empire they said to Britain and France, it's yours. Britain and France could have, if they wished to, under international law, even today, have said, okay, it's going to be our colonies, or our territory. They didn't. They made a political decision that they were going to give independence to the Arab states, and to Palestine, they were going to apply the Balfour Declaration. Now, the Balfour Declaration was a political statement at the time. It was not a binding international agreement. It may seem strange for me to claim this, but it wasn't. When one looks at the language of it, and you've seen it, obviously, it was a letter addressed by the British Foreign Secretary to a British citizen, to Lord Rothschild. That is not an international agreement. It was a political statement, an awfully important political statement for the Zionist movement, vitally important, by what was then the superpower, Britain. But it was a political statement. It was not a legally binding agreement. How did it transform, or how did the British and French transform it into a legally binding document? Some of it you heard from the previous lecture. They agreed in a written agreement in San Remo that Britain would be given a mandate to administer Palestine, not as British territory, but as administered British territory, and to implement the creation of a Jewish national home. So here, if you look at the legal mechanism, it was sovereign Ottoman territory. The Ottomans, by the way, acquired it by force, but that's irrelevant. If you acquire something by force and you rule it for 500 years, it's yours. Reality. It was sovereign Ottoman territory beginning of the First World War. They lost the First World War. They signed and ratified an agreement, later ratified an agreement with Britain and France saying, the empire is yours, do with it what you want. Britain and France decided that for Palestine, they would implement what had been previously a political statement, the Balfour Declaration, legally binding. That could have been sufficient. But they took one step further. They got this seal of approval of the League of Nations. As you heard, approved unanimously, which authorized Britain to apply the Balfour Declaration to Palestine. And they added a text which didn't appear in Balfour. And I'm quoting verbatim from the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. After saying that His Britannic Majesty shall act in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, they added, whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting, I'm of course emphasizing it, their national home in that country. This, whenever you come into an argument with Arab propagandists, you'll hear discussions about Balfour, you'll be complete silence that the League of Nations made this declaration. And they did it because they were aware of the fact that this was a special case. This was a case of reuniting, reconstituting a national home that had already existed. That's why we're seeing strenuous efforts now, again, by the Palestinians to undermine this, to undermine the fact that the basis of creating a Jewish national home was based on international law with the unanimous approval of the League of Nations. How else are they doing it? Not only by trying to undermine Balfour, but other issues which you may have or may not have come across in the press. One is self-determination. Listen carefully, you'll hear self-determination for Palestinians. Personally, I believe they have a right of self-determination. You'll absolute silence self-determination for Israel. And it's worth pointing this out every time you come into us. You're talking about self-determination. What about self-determination of the Palestinian, for Israel? Often you'll get sort of mumbling, well, it depends. And I think it's a point we can all emphasize. It works both ways. How many times we've heard for the UN resolution, self-determination for Palestinians? No problem with that. But it comes side by side with self-determination for Israel. How are the two going to settle it? By negotiations. Another issue that you may have come across is the phrase, the Israeli illegal occupation of the West Bank. It's become horse and carriage, to always come together. Occupation is not something one can try and sell as a wonderful item, but it's perfectly legal. Perfectly legal in international law. Think after the end of the Second World War, when the Allies occupied Germany, perfectly legal. When the US occupied Japan, perfectly legal. When the US occupied Iraq after the First World War, First Gulf War, perfectly legal. And it's worth remembering the UN Security Council, which is not a body composed mainly of pro-Israeli speakers, has never used the word illegal occupation. Why not? Because on the Security Council, you've got Britain and France and the United States and Russia and China, all of whom know that it's part, under the laws of war, it's perfectly legal. Of course, that doesn't prevent this illegal Israeli occupation, and they've succeeded. We've got to admit where we failed. They've succeeded in sort of branding it illegal Israeli occupation. We built a separation wall between Israel and the West Bank. No walls are pleasant, no borders are pleasant. I hope we can all live in a society with no borders or no walls. But many parts of the world, even less problematic than Israel, have border fences. The border fence that we built is not I would say it's not it's a passive border. There's no machine guns, there's no mines, there's no electrocution. It's a warning. You touch it, the bell goes off, and we know somebody's entered. That's all it is. It's passive. It's not the Berlin Wall. Nevertheless, they've managed somehow, and here again, it's a failure of us, to brand it as an apartheid wall. It has nothing to do whatsoever with apartheid. But they've succeeded. When I was in the Israeli Foreign Ministry, I was sent on all sorts of not pleasant missions. One of them was to represent Israel before the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in Geneva. Well, I'm quite happy there's no racial discrimination in Israel. I had no problem. I found myself under fire for doing this, but Israel does. One of the things that irked me was an accusation made, Israel is a racist state. Why? Look at the symbol on your flag. It's a religious symbol, the Star of David. Therefore, how can you expect Arabs in Israel to be loyal when you have a religious symbol on your flag? At the time, I was a diplomat. I'm no longer a diplomat. The meeting took place in Geneva. So I didn't know whether I should say anything about the Swiss flag, so I shut up. I didn't know whether I should say anything about the Scandinavian nations that are not exactly racist nations. Every single one of them has a cross. Or the United Kingdom, which at the moment I think has 3 or 4 crosses. They may have less if Scotland leaves. Or all the Arab states, which have... But Israel was somehow branded, it's a racist state. So I shut up, because I was a diplomat. Another issue that you'll find Israel is being branded for violating UN resolutions. All of you have heard this. Israel violates UN resolutions, therefore, ipso facto, it violates international law. It's worth probing this. UN General Assembly resolutions are not binding. No state in the world accepts them as binding. No Arab state, except as regards Israel. Lawyers would say it's a sui generis, it's one of a type. General Assembly resolutions are political statements. But as regards Israel, they're somehow considered to be binding. And they're often meaningless political statements, because the UN is built on a lovely system which sounds democratic. One state, one vote. Sounds wonderful. Until you look at it, that means that Micronesia and China each have the same weight. It's meaningless in the real world. There's a bloc of 57 Muslim states that can pass anything they want. Abba Eban, the Israeli foreign minister, once wisecracked that if there was they proposed a resolution that the earth was flat, they would get a majority, and some members of the EU might abstain because they weren't quite sure about it. But they would get a majority. Yeah. By the way, it's never happened, but theoretically, you could have a 2/3 majority, which sounds so impressive. 2/3 majority of the General Assembly. The minority could be the US, Canada, China, Russia, India, Japan, and the whole of the EU. You would still have 2/3 majority. In the real world, it's meaningless. And that's why, by the way, the wise drafters of the UN Charter did not give the UN General Assembly any power to make binding resolutions. Nevertheless, you'll hear again and again, Israel has violated General Assembly resolutions. By the way, perhaps the most nefarious body in the UN is the one that should be the most enlightened, the Human Rights Council. It recently made a call for boycott of Israel. Again, to a student in a university, when the UN Human Rights Council calls for boycott of Israeli companies and so on, it sounds wonderful. I looked up the criterion for membership of the United Nations General Assembly. I'm quoting from the Human Rights Council. I'm quoting from the General Assembly resolution. The General Assembly takes into account the candidate states' contribution to the promotion and protection of human rights. That is the consideration for membership in the Human Rights Council. And such luminary states, and I gave it, there's quite a whole lot of them, but some of them I made a note of. China, known for promotion and protection of human rights. Saudi Arabia. Now, it may have common political interests with Israel at the moment, but to say it acts to promotion and protection of human rights, I think is a bit strange. Indonesia, I'm also not sure, though here, perhaps in the Netherlands, you're more aware of it. Pakistan, its main object in life is promoting human rights. Qatar, another proponent of human rights. Venezuela. Egypt. Now, again, we have good relations with Egypt, and I like Egypt and so on, but to say that they contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights. Iraq, obviously, that's the only thing they're worried about is human rights. And United Arab Emirates. This is the UN Human Rights Council. Its decisions are purely political, but nevertheless, I'm sure you may get well-meaning students, universities, looking at a document saying, well, this is a declaration by the UN Human Rights Council. What other issues have been of international law that are applied sui generis to Israel? In 1949, Israel signed armistice agreements with all its Arab neighbors. With Jordan and with Egypt, we've since signed peace agreements and we have full borders. We do not yet have an agreement with the Palestinians. Personally, I hope we do have one. But again and again, you'll hear, including from friendly EU states, saying, well, the 1949 armistice line is the line. It's worthwhile asking why. Nowhere in the world are armistice lines considered to be permanent boundaries. Nowhere. The actual armistice line agreement, the armistice agreement says, at the instigation of the Arab states, this is not a political boundary. It doesn't entail recognition of Israel. It's not a permanent boundary. It says that in the armistice agreements. Now, whether Israel should adopt this as a boundary with a future Palestinian entity is a political question. Each one of us here has his own views on that. But to say legally, on what basis? It's worthwhile asking legal advisors to any government. Do armistice agreements create permanent boundaries when they say they're not? They don't. But as regards Israel, somehow the 1949 armistice, or the Green Line, that the synonymous, is a permanent boundary. We must withdraw to it. Again, I'm not saying perhaps we would, in a negotiation, we may use it as a basis. But to say we're legally bound to do it. What other issues have I found? A right of return. Arab refugees. Every citizen has a right of return to his country. Clear international law. We're not talking about people who are Israeli citizens or Israeli residents, or who ever have been Israeli residents or Israeli nationals. And we're not talking about them, we're talking about their children and grandchildren. This is a clear invention. Think of it, that if your grandparents came from a country, that means you have a right to go to that country? No country in the world accepts it. Some countries, as a matter of national policy, will give preference to people of their origin. Germany does it to Germans, Ireland does it to Irish, Israel does it to Jews. That's national, but international legal obligation, nevertheless, you will hear a right of return. There's no such right. And by the way, this makes negotiating more difficult, because one of the issues we'll have to negotiate with the Palestinians, of course, is the refugees, the property of Jews in Arab countries as well. But the Arab Palestinians and the Arab states come to us and say, no, accept the principle. And Israel said there is no such principle. Sometimes you can't accept a principle. It's not politically correct, but there's a story of the British playwright Bernard Shaw, who once approached a lady and said, "Madam, are you willing to spend the night with me for £1 million sterling, cash?" She said, £1 million sterling? And then it was a lot of money. She said, "Well, I'll give it consideration." He then went on, of course, and said, "Well, are you willing to spend the night with me for £10? She said, "What do you think I am, a prostitute?" He said, "That we've already decided. We're talking about the price." Sometimes the principle is not there. There is no right of return. That doesn't mean that we can't sit and negotiate. But here, international law, in fact, I find harms the chance of reaching an agreement, because they say insist on it. But the same is true of UN resolutions. Often I found when sitting with them, they said, "Well, you must accept the UN resolution." We said, "It's not binding. Accept it. There's a UN resolution on refugees." So sometimes international law is not helpful. There's the editor of the New Republic, American journal, Krautheimer, once wrote something, and I'm quoting from an article he wrote: "Turning foreign policy over to the lawyers is the laziest, the most brainless way to make policy. The law, international law, is an ass. It has nothing to offer." Then he goes on: "Foreign policy is best made without it. Go in, do what you have to do, and then call in the lawyers to find some retroactive justification for what you've done." He called it the curse of legal. Of course, it's not true. And that's why I started off by saying, why international? In very, very rare cases it happens. And if I can add from my personal experience, in 1976, July, I was Deputy Legal Advisor of the Foreign Ministry, and I was called in to the Director General to come to the office in the middle of the night. Came in, and there are other colleagues of mine there, and he said, "We're closing the doors, you can't use the phone. You can't be in contact with the outside world." And then he explained why. Israeli commandos on the way to Entebbe to try and rescue the Israelis on the Air France aircraft that was hijacked to Uganda. He turned to each one of us, he turned to me, he said, "Robbie, you prepare a legal argument why it's legal." He turned to the UN man and said, "You prepare a document to the UN, etc." I was not asked in advance, is it legal? Frankly, I would have said yes, But sometimes secrecy is so important, you can't spread it. But it's very rare. Most of the time, international law plays a vital part in negotiations. What other issues, something that you people have suffered from? Civilian casualties means you violated the laws of war. Rubbish. When you're fighting a war, there are civilian casualties. When you're fighting a group like Hamas that places its rockets in its cities, in its schools, next to its hospitals, you're going to get civilian casualties. The test is, did you do it deliberately? Or were you reckless? Or were you careless? But if you took all reasonable steps to prevent civilian casualties, you're blameless. But we haven't managed to persuade the world on this. Heavy civilian casualties means a serious crime. Absolutely rubbish. It's worthwhile looking at the civilian casualties caused by the Allies during the Second World War. In the Normandy, I read there were 40,000 French civilians killed in the initial attack on Calais and on Normandy coast. A war crime? But nevertheless, they've succeeded in somehow saying, civilian casualties. The issue, of course, what did you intend? When I studied law, one of the courses we had to do was Introduction to Psychology. And something that stuck in my memory was a test for maturity. You asked a little kid, if a child deliberately breaks one plate, or another child, by mistake, breaks 10 plates, who is the naughtier child? And you can judge the maturity by how they react to that. The intention is, did you intend to do? And by the way, we've had meetings of judge advocate generals from European, North American, Asian countries in Israel. I attended one of the meetings, and they said, look, Israel army took greater precautions to prevent civilian casualties than any other army that we know. But not perhaps because we're moral, because it doesn't serve our purpose. It serves the Hamas purpose. The moment there's a civilian casualties, this is headlines. We also moral considerations, but there's a combination. Israel did not want civilian casualties. It's harmful to us, it's harmful to our morals. This came from the Judge Advocate General, so it doesn't prevent the press talking about war crimes because Israel caused civilian casualties. Israel's record, strangely enough, in international law is very good. Why? Perhaps because we're a society imbued with law, perhaps because we have a High Court of Justice that enforces it, and sometimes we gain from this. I was negotiating with the Egyptians, and I had a meeting with a very senior Egyptian diplomat, no friend of Israel. And he said to me, Robbie, negotiating with you Israelis is hell. But, and here came an interesting but, he said, but I must admit, you have a reputation that if agreement is reached with you, you keep it, you stick to it. He afterwards told me the background to this. He said, look, I was having discussion, and again, he was not a friend of Israel. I was having arguments with my Egyptian colleagues, he said this to me, who told me, no point negotiating about Sinai with Israel, they'll never withdraw. And he said, no, you're wrong. I don't like the Israelis, they're difficult to argue, but if they do undertake to do something, they'll carry it out. It's a tremendous asset in political relations to have a reputation for keeping to an agreement. Two other issues. Let's see what my time situation is like. I don't know what it is the question of the Fourth Geneva Convention, is the West Bank occupied territory? I'm talking about legally, and again, I'm not talking about whether we should negotiate or what. Israel has a case. Under the laws of war, territory is occupied if you occupy the territory of a foreign state. There are rules that apply to it. Israel had a real dilemma. Whose territory are we occupying? This is certainly true of Gaza. Egyptian territory, Egypt never claimed that it was Egyptian territory. West Bank, Jordan did. Since then, since 1988, it's given it up. So when we're capturing Gaza, whose territory, the territory of which state were we occupying? An answer could be it may be a Palestinian state. It might well be in the future. But that still has to be created, and nobody knows what its boundaries will be. They themselves are vague about what the boundaries are. So to say that we're occupying the territory of a foreign state, Israel has a very good legal argument. It's questionable. What it will do, and this, I think any other state, it would have served as a precedent. We said, look, we don't believe this is the territory of a foreign state that's been occupied by. Nevertheless, Israel will grant the population of the territory all the rights of people living under military occupation. Therefore, we apply the rules. But we say, we're putting aside, we don't question whether it's legally, it's an occupied territory of a foreign state. So I think it's a useful precedent for cases where states believe a territory is not occupied. Nevertheless, give the population the protection. For political reasons, the world hasn't welcomed this. They say, no, you must recognize that it's an occupied territory. And we say, there is a question mark about this. It's not so completely clear whether it's an occupied territory. Nevertheless, the people have the protection of the laws of international IHL, international humanitarian law. I really think for any other state, this would have been welcomed. And this is tied with the question of settlements. The only rule against settlements is in the Fourth Geneva Convention dealing with occupied territory. This is the question. Again, each one of us has his own views, whether it's wise, whether we should compromise. That's not the issue. Legality? To make absolutely, is it clear that somebody's returning, in some cases, they're returning to the homes from which they were expelled? Gush Etzion, Hebron, Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, or Old City. That's illegal. Why? Because Jordan occupied it in 48 and then gave it up. Israel has a case. Again, for political reasons, the only state we managed to persuade, by the way, was the United States. And if you look carefully at the United States declarations, they don't say it's illegal. What they do say, it's harmful to the peace process. So how much we've gained from this, I don't know exactly. But they don't say it's illegal. Everybody else says it's illegal. What else? Complying with treaties. Israel has a reputation for complying with treaties. We're facing a clear Palestinian violation of the agreement. The basis of the Oslo Agreement, Declaration of Principles, 1993, was neither side would change unilaterally the status of the territory. The Palestinians have declared themselves a state. Sometimes they change their mind and say, we will be a state. It's a clear violation. The world is silent. Can you imagine what would happen if Israel would have acted unilaterally? Condemnation? The world is silent. There's a special status of international law applicable only to Israel. And finally, self-defense. And here I'd like to end on a cartoon that I saw years ago in a French newspaper. The cartoon was that of an animal in a cage, and underneath it was a warning. Be careful, beware. This animal is dangerous. When attacked, it defends itself. Thank you very much.